So now you're familiar with subscriptions, management groups, and so on, but are you still wondering how best to set them up in order to make the most room for growth? Or maybe you've tried learning Microsoft's best practices on this, only to find the cloud adoption framework, hub and spoke, so daunting that you've just given up on it? Well, in this video, I'll cover the basics of a good and scalable Azure design. We'll talk about how to structure your management groups, how and where to assign what kind of access, as well as take a look at a really simple and scalable way of organizing network. Sound good? Cool. So this video is part 2 of a series. If you're not familiar with the building blocks like management groups, Azure policy, and so on, I suggest you check out part 1 of this series, which covers the basics on them. Now let's kick this off by talking about management groups. How should you arrange them and what value can they bring? First of all, you don't need management groups in your design, but I highly recommend it. Also, I recommend you set up a decently sized hierarchy of them, plan big, make a lot of room for growth. Keep in mind that neither management groups or subscriptions in themselves cost money, so there's not a whole lot of reasons not to have multiple ones. First up, a couple of quick tips. Management groups can support a depth of up to 6 levels in addition to the tenant root group, but don't go there. Keep it relatively flat. By default, management groups can be created by everyone, so disable that. All new Azure subscriptions will be placed under the tenant root group by default. Change that. Don't use the management groups to duplicate your organization chart. Now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at an example that Microsoft uses in their Azure landing zone design. This is a setup that I really like and one that I recommend you incorporate in your designs. So let's see what Microsoft is thinking here. If we start at the top, you might wonder why on earth would you create a management group under the tenant root group with the company name as opposed to just skipping that level? Well, one reason is having this level is a good idea is if you engage, for example, an external company to set up a SAP environment, then that external company might insist on delivering this on subscriptions provided by them and solely managed by them. This is actually not an unusual scenario, and being able to add them as a separate management group directly under the tenant root group allows for a complete separation between them and your environment. This also goes for if your company is doing a merger with a company that already has an Azure environment. Then you can just migrate those resources into its own management group directly under the tenant root group. Moving to the next level in this reference structure, we can see that platform, landing zones, decommissioned, and sandbox. So let's cover them left to right, starting with platform. Here is where all common and shared services that your entire Azure environment uses should be placed. Identity, for example, could hold your domain controllers or Azure AD domain services. Management could hold central log analytics workspaces or some form of jump service like AVD, Windows 365 Enterprise, while connectivity could hold your express routes, your Azure firewalls, or other VPN solutions. Landing zones will contain your, landing zones. This is where you put the workhorses in your environment, where all the heavy lifting happens. All the other parts of your Azure environment is really only there to provide the tools that the services here need. In the example here, you can see that Microsoft has suggested splitting it up into SAP, Corp, and Online. It goes without saying that you don't need an SAP management group if you don't use SAP, but it stands as an example of what you can set up here in the landing zones management group. The Corp management group is where you'd put everything that needs network connectivity with the rest of your corporate network. That could be your on-prem environment. Online is where you'd put stuff that isn't dependent on any other internal network connectivity. For example, any solution that would live in its own little silo, or any solution that doesn't need a VNet at all. And that leaves us with the decommissioned and sandbox. Decommissioned is pretty self-explanatory. It's where you'd put any decommissioned subscriptions that are ready for deletion. And remember when I said you should change the default location for subscriptions? Well, the sandbox is where you'd put it. The sandbox management group should be a place for testing, experimenting, and in other ways exploring Azure. This is often the case for MSDN or Visual Studio Benefits subscriptions, so making sure you have a dedicated space for new subscription is a really good idea. Keep in mind though that dev and test environments for specific workloads should be placed within the same management group as their production counterpart. This way they are as similar as possible to their production pals. Now that you have this beautiful structure of management groups and subscriptions, it's time to hand out some access. So just give everyone who needs access the global admin rights, right? No, just don't. I think it was Sami Laho that said, if you have fewer than 2 or more than 3 global admins, you're doing it wrong. And he's right. Normal user accounts should never be global admins, and be especially careful with the user access administrator role a global admin can turn on in Azure AD. It's tempting to just assign yourself this role, and in that way, make sure you have access to everything in your Azure environment. But no one, and I mean no one, should have this role permanently active. It's just that big of a security risk. So create a couple of break glass accounts and assign them the global admin role. Then remove any other global admins you have. These break glass accounts should of course be monitored, and you should enable alerts for whenever someone uses them and so on. Microsoft has a pretty decent guide on this, so I'm not going in detail there. You can find a link to it down in the description. And while you're down there looking, also make sure that you hit the like button and subscribe if you're not already. Okay, so now that you've gotten rid of the global admins, let's discuss some basic principles of how and where to set up access control to your Azure environment, and also what roles to use. If we start with where you should assign access, then that management group structure that I was using as an example is a good reference point. The tenant root group is where a really small number of people should be giving access. This would typically be your architects and senior staff members. Same would go for Contoso in this example. Then you can start handing out access to those of your staff that are a little more specialized. For example, your identity staff could be given access to only the identity management group. Your network staff could be given access to connectivity and corp, for example, and so on. Giving people access at the lowest level possible is one of the steps to a least privileged kind of setup, and we all know that that's what everyone wants. As to what roles you should be handing out, that of course depends on the responsibilities that your staff members have. But one role that is often handed out without much thought is the owner role. And it's very rare that anyone would need that role. The owner role is basically the sum of 2 roles, the contributor role and the user access administrator role. And if you're wondering what these roles do, well, contributor is pretty much an all-access pass to do pretty much everything in Azure, except the one thing that user access administrator allows you to do: assign access. So switching the default role you give everyone from owner to contributor is a very simple and huge step forward in terms of, not giving people too much access. Because not a whole lot of people should need the ability to assign access to others. That should be limited to a very small number of people. But also consider handing out other more specific roles. For example, you can assign the people only needing access to VMs the VM contributor role instead of the contributor role. Network staff could be given the network contributor role instead of contributor role, and so on. You can also combine 2 or more specific roles instead of going up 1 level. For example, the VM guy that also needs to work with the odd storage accounts can be given the VM contributor and the storage account contributor instead of the contributor role. See how there's a pattern in the naming of these roles? So look for the lowest level of access you can give people at the lowest possible level, and your Azure environment will be a lot safer. Also, check out Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, which provides the option to assign all these roles as eligible instead of always active. This means that a role needs to be activated by the user when they want to use it, as opposed to always being active, further securing your environment a whole lot. Structure in place and access handle. Let's look at a nice way to organize your network. After all, most Azure environments will need network connectivity, and you don't want to have a total anarchy of VNets here, there, and everywhere, and then peerings crisscrossing all out, do you? Do you? A very simple concept that also scales well is the hub and spoke topology, and personally, I've grown to like this approach a whole lot. In addition to being simple and scaling well, it's easy to wrap your head around because it's easy to see where everything is connecting and where traffic is flowing. It's also pretty cost-effective setup as you reduce the number of firewalls required, for example. Basically, the hub and spoke topology means that you create a central hub where all network traffic flows through, and then spokes for all services. That's logical to group together. The central hub would typically house a firewall for controlling network flow between the spokes and the internet, a VPN gateway for connecting your on-prem environment with Azure, or for VPN client access, and perhaps even a way to do management, like Azure Bastion in this scenario. Microsoft likes to use Azure Firewall in this kind of setup, but you don't have to use it if you feel that it's a bit too pricey. You can use what's referred to as NVAs, or network virtual appliances, from a variety of vendors like Fortinet, Kemp, Checkpoint, F5, Cisco, and so on. You can also start small and just use a virtual network gateway to handle the routing between spokes and use NSGs as your firewall. The central hub could also house shared services like Active Directory, although I personally like to put these kinds of services in their own spoke. The spokes in this kind of setup should be isolated, and all traffic to and from them should go through the main hub. This removes the need for peering between all your VNets, and instead you only need to peer each spoke with the hub. A lot less complicated and a lot more manageable. And as your environment grows, you simply keep adding more and more spokes. If you ever get near the limit for a number of peerings in the main hub, which would be 400 or 500 depending on how you look at it, or you're building a global infrastructure, you can create multiple hubs and then peer those together as well, providing more than enough room to grow. The disadvantage of this kind of setup is latency. Having all network traffic go through a central hub instead of just skipping across a peering between two spokes adds a bit of latency. In my opinion, the simplicity and scalability is worth the added latency, but if it turns out to be too much latency between some of your spokes, you can create peerings directly between the spokes if you so want. It just complicates things a bit. If you're looking for further learnings on scalable Azure designs, I will have a part 3 in this series where I cover things like Azure policy and landing zones, as well as showing off and walking through an example design. It may already be up here in the corner. If not, then make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you'll know when it will be up there. Thanks for watching.